January 14th, 1945. Radomierz, occupied Poland. Strzałka 23 a.m., the railway signal tower at the central station. The building smelled of old industrial oil and water-soaked wood as Elena Novak started up the metal stairs toward the control cabin. The sky was completely empty. No stars, no moon. Just the dense black of winter and that heavy silence that sometimes settles in right before a decision splits a life in two. At that hour, the station still breathed with the slow pulse of night. Frost-coated rails caught the weak yellow glow of the platforms, and idle locomotives released their last tired sighs of steam into the frozen air. On the side tracks stood freight cars loaded with military supplies that would never reach their destination because the front moved closer every day. The Red Army was less than 50 kilometers away, and you could feel it. Not as sound, but as pressure. Something unseen pressing against the air. Elena had been awake for 18 hours. Her shift had ended at 10 the previous night, but the early morning operator had been taken by the Gestapo 2 days earlier. No charges, no explanation. Just gone. Like so many others who vanished without leaving a trace. Now Elena worked double and triple shifts, hands on the levers that ruled the switches, deciding which trains went east, which west, and which north, where a few lines were still operational. She had learned how to survive by following orders exactly. No questions. No thinking too hard about what those trains carried as they cut through the night. Sealed cars. Pale faces appearing briefly between the slats. Muffled cries dissolving into distance as convoys rolled toward places everyone knew about and no one dared name. To the Germans, she was just another useful Polish worker, an efficient operator who had inherited the post from her father, a railwayman executed in 1940 for a sabotage he never committed, someone who understood. Rails the way other people understood the streets of their neighborhood. Exactly the kind of person the system needed to keep running while it collapsed. Then came the order that changed everything. At 04:17, the phone in the cabin shattered the silence with the sharp ring reserved for priority communications. Elena lifted the receiver, her fingers stiff with cold. "This is Otto Reinhard Weiss, Special Transport Command," the voice said, precise, almost mechanical. "Train Sonder 47 will arrive at your station in 22 minutes. Absolute priority. Route to Auschwitz-Birkenau. East switch 3. No delays. Confirm." Elena recognized the code instantly. Sonder. Special transport. The word they used for deportation trains. "Confirmed," she replied evenly, writing it into the logbook. 0439, Sonder train, 47, East switch 3, Auschwitz. She hung up and stared at the control panel in front of her. 36 black iron levers, each one tied to a different point in the web of tracks that made up Radomierz station. Each lever decided whether a train ran straight or was diverted, whether it stayed on its assigned route or slipped onto another. Simple in theory. Merciless in practice. East switch 3 was the third lever from the left on the top row. An old acquaintance. She had pulled it dozens of times. It sent trains southeast, where the lines merged with the main network leading to the camps of Upper Silesia. Elena stood motionless, watching the dull sheen of the levers under the kerosene lamp. She knew exactly what that train meant, who was inside, where they were being sent every time she pulled that particular lever. She had always known, but for years she had built mental walls. Walls meant to stop the thought, block the feeling, keep the reality of her nightly actions from breaking through. Feeling in those days was a dangerous luxury. For 5 years she kept those walls standing. 5 years of moving iron. 5 years of dispatching trains to places without names. 5 years of telling herself she was only operating mechanisms, that the decisions were made by others, that she was nothing more than a piece without a will of its own inside a machine that would have kept running with or without her. But that dawn, something didn't quite fit. Maybe it was exhaustion, so deep it finally wore down the mental barriers that had protected her for years. Maybe it was the Red Army, close enough now that, for the first time in 5 years, the end of the war stopped being an abstract idea. Or maybe after dispatching dozens of those trains, one more had simply become unbearable. Or maybe it was her father. Stefan Novak, executed for an act of sabotage he denied until his final breath. Trains only go where they're sent, he used to say. But what happens when the one sending them is sending people to their deaths? At what point does responsibility stop belonging to the system and begin to belong to the individual? Elena closed her eyes. She couldn't see the real faces of the people on that particular train. She had never looked directly at the prisoners, but she saw the imagined ones that filled her nightmares. Children, old men, mothers, fathers. People who had once had lives, jobs, plans, before everything was stripped away. She thought of her mother, widowed since 1940, dependent on Elena's wages to stay alive. If Elena were arrested for sabotage, her mother would not survive more than a few weeks. That was the simple, brutal truth. But the 2,400 people on that train also had mothers, or were mothers, or had once been someone's children. The moral arithmetic refused to add up. Was one known life worth more than thousands of anonymous ones? Did personal survival justify complicity in mass murder? Where was the line between self-preservation and moral cowardice? She had no answers, only 8 minutes before the train arrived, and demanded that she move one of those levers. At 04:31, she heard the distant whistle of the convoy approaching. The sound cut through the night like a metallic scream. Then came the growing clatter of wheels on steel, the groan of brakes beginning to bite. Elena drew a deep breath and reached for East Switch 3, and then she saw her reflection in the glass of the cabin. It wasn't her face. It was her father's. Stefan Novak. The day he had taught her how to work the levers when she was 16. Every time you move one of these, he had told her, serious, you're changing the fate of hundreds of people. Never forget that. Don't let it become automatic. Every decision matters. Her father was executed after a military train derailed. They called it sabotage. He insisted until the end that it was a mechanical failure. Elena never knew what had really happened. The train was less than a kilometer away now. Her hand hovered over the lever. Cold iron pressed into her fingers as the noise closed in. She could imagine the faces inside the sealed cars. 2,000, 3,000, maybe more. Entire families, children and the elderly, all headed for the same destination, the one no one returned from. And then, in a moment, she would never fully be able to explain, not decades later, not during the sleepless nights when she replayed every second of that dawn. Elena's hand moved 6 centimeters to the right. It wasn't a conscious decision in the classic sense. There was no heroic flash of clarity where she decided to save those lives regardless of the cost. No cold calculation of risks and outcomes. There wasn't even time to fully understand what she was doing. It was something else. Instinctive. Visceral. Like pulling your hand away from fire before you feel the burn. Like catching a falling object before you decide to move. An act born in that narrow space between thought and action, where the body responds to something the mind hasn't yet put into words. Her hand simply moved. It did not touch East Switch 3, the one gleaming in its familiar position, the one she had pulled so many times to send Sonder trains south and east. She touched East Switch 4, barely 6 centimeters to the right, almost identical to the previous one, but connected to an entirely different junction pointing northeast. The mechanism answered with the familiar metallic click Elena Novak had heard all her life, followed by the dull impact of iron on iron, gears engaging, cables tightening across hundreds of meters until they reached the physical switches on the tracks. It was a sound she had heard thousands of times. This time it sounded different. Final, irreversible. Outside in the darkness, the rails shifted. The switch points rotated with mechanical precision, offering a new path to the approaching train. And Sonder Train 47, with its 2,400 prisoners sealed inside 19 cattle cars, guards unaware that anything had changed, a destination already written and just rewritten, took a curve it was never meant to take. Elena felt the exact moment the wheels crossed the switch, a barely different vibration in the building, an almost imperceptible adjustment of metal against metal. She knew then that there was no going back. Nothing could be undone. She stood frozen, staring at her own hand gripping East Switch 4 as if it didn't belong to her. Fingers clenched around cold iron, arm extended, body leaning forward in the automatic posture of someone who has just completed a routine task. What had she done? Maybe it was a mistake. Maybe extreme exhaustion, 18 hours without rest, nights of broken sleep, years of accumulated trauma, had caused her to confuse one lever for another. East 3 and East 4 were too close. Under the weak glow of the kerosene lamp, the error was almost understandable. But it might also have been deliberate. Maybe in that fraction of a second before the movement, she felt something else. Not heroism, not courage, just refusal. A refusal to take part one more time. To pull another lever that sent people to their deaths. To keep being an efficient cog in a machine built for extermination. Was it sabotage? That would be the Germans' question, if they discovered what had happened. And the answer would decide whether Elena lived or died in the coming hours. In occupied Poland, sabotage had a precise weight. It wasn't disobedience. It was capital treason, the same crime for which her father had been executed. It was the accusation the Germans used for any failure, intentional or not, that interfered with their operations. If they investigated and decided it was deliberate, Elena would be tortured until she confessed ties to a resistance that did not exist, then executed publicly, like Stefan Novak. Her mother would be interrogated, likely arrested. Elena's name would end up on warning posters pasted across the city. If, on the other hand, they ruled it human error caused by exhaustion, she might survive. A reprimand, increased surveillance, but alive. And the 2,400 people on that train? East Switch 4 led northeast, toward lines near the active front, toward territories rumors said the Red Army was liberating day by day. If the train went far enough before anyone noticed, if it ran for hours instead of minutes, there was a chance. A tiny one. Almost infinitesimal. Elena could not allow herself to think about it. Hope and disappointment were luxuries more dangerous than fear under occupation. At last she released the lever. Sweat marks darkened the black iron despite the cold filling the cabin. She walked slowly to the north-facing window and stared into the darkness where the train had vanished. The rear lights of the last car were barely visible, 2 red dots blinking like retreating eyes, until the sound dissolved completely and only the thick silence of early morning remained. The station returned to its usual stillness. Motionless rails gleaming under dim lamps. Steam from sleeping locomotives rising slowly into the frozen air. Everything looked the same as it had 5 minutes earlier, except that 2,400 people had just changed course without knowing it, and Elena Novak had crossed a line whose meaning, or consequences, she could not yet understand. The train disappeared into the night. Red lights blinking, sound fading, silence settling back in. Elena wrote in the logbook, 0439, Sonder train, 47, East Switch 4. Alternate route due to maintenance on main line. It was a lie. There was no maintenance, no obstruction. Just a lever moved 6 centimeters to the right. Instead of returning it to its proper position, she sat down in the wooden chair by the window, her legs trembling, and waited for dawn or for the Gestapo, whichever arrived first. This is not a story of planned heroism. It is the story of a hand that moved 6 centimeters in the wrong direction, or the right one, depending on who tells it, and of 2,400 people who kept breathing because of a gesture that lasted less than 2 seconds. If this story reached you, support it with a like and subscribe so you don't miss future videos. If you'd like to become a channel member or simply support the work, click the thanks button and help us grow. And tell me in the comments which city and country you're watching from. I want to know from where you stand with those history tried to silence. In January 1945, Poland was in its final agony after 5 years of Nazi occupation, and the railway system had become the central artery of organized horror. Thousands of kilometers of track that once moved commerce, families, and hope now carried only the machinery of German destruction. Military trains to a collapsing front, supply convoys to besieged cities, and above all, Sonder trains, special transports packed with human beings bound for extermination camps. Radomierz was a strategic rail hub in Upper Silesia. Before the war, 120 trains passed through its station every day. By January 1945, that number had fallen to 40, but each one carried the weight of a regime's last desperate decisions. The Red Army advanced relentlessly from the east. Soviet forces had liberated Warsaw just 3 days earlier. German lines were breaking one after another, and in their chaotic retreat, the Nazis tried to complete one final task: erase evidence. Empty the camps before the liberators arrived. Move prisoners west, toward Germany, where they could still operate without witnesses. But the rail system was coming apart. Allied bombings had destroyed key bridges. Partisans sabotaged tracks. Locomotives ran out of coal. And in the middle of that collapse, operators like Elena Novak kept the machinery running just enough for the last trains to carry out their lethal mission. Elena was 23 years old, though her face looked closer to 30. She was born into a railway family. Her father, Stefan, had worked the rails since he was 14, first cleaning locomotives, then as a fireman, and finally as a signal operator. The most respected position among railway workers, demanding absolute precision and nerves of steel. Stefan taught her everything: how the switches worked, how to read signals, how to listen to a locomotive and hear when something was wrong. He passed on his love for that world of iron and steam that connected cities and shortened distances. When the Germans invaded in September 1939, Stefan kept working. Someone had to. Life didn't stop just because foreign tanks appeared. Trains were still indispensable. People still needed to move. Supplies still had to reach somewhere. Trains aren't Nazi or Polish, Stefan used to say, with the practical logic forged by decades of physical labor. Trains simply go where they're sent. But in March 1940, A German military train loaded with ammunition and soldiers derailed violently at a switch Stefan had operated the night before. The convoy overturned completely. Several cars caught fire. 19 German soldiers died. Some burned alive, others crushed under twisted metal. The Germans arrested him immediately, even before the bodies were removed from the still smoking wreckage. They dragged him out of his house at 4 a.m, in front of Elena and her mother, frozen with terror. He was taken to the Gestapo cells in the city center, that gray building everyone knew and no one dared look at directly when passing by. For 3 days they tortured him systematically, trying to extract a confession of deliberate sabotage. They wanted names, accomplices, links to the resistance, a full story of organized betrayal to feed their paranoia about internal enemies. Stefan gave them nothing, because there was nothing to give. Again and again, even while being beaten, he swore it had been a mechanical failure in East Switch 7. He explained that the lever had been resisting for weeks, that he had reported the issue to his supervisor, that no replacement had been authorized due to budget constraints. Inspections confirmed abnormal wear in the cable system of East Switch 7. The supervisor admitted Stefan had reported the problem. Maintenance logs showed repairs had been scheduled for the future. But the Germans weren't looking for truth. They needed an example. On the 4th day, they executed him at the station as a public warning to all railway workers. Every employee was forced to attend. Elena was 18. She watched as a German officer, a Hauptmann whose name she never learned, but whose face she would never forget, read the charges in German, a language few fully understood. Stefan Nowak, Polish railway worker, accused and found guilty of deliberate sabotage of German military transport, resulting in 19 German deaths. Sentence: immediate execution. Stefan knelt on platform 3, the same platform where he had worked for 20 years, his hands tied behind his back. His face was swollen and distorted from torture, but his eyes were still clear when he searched for Elena in the crowd forced to watch. "It wasn't sabotage," he shouted, his voice broken but steady. "It was a mechanical failure. East Switch 7, check it." The officer struck him on the head with the butt of his pistol. Stefan collapsed sideways but kept speaking. "The switch. Always the switch. Check them all." The gunshot cut him off. His body jerked once and went still on the cold concrete of the platform. The officer wiped his hand with a handkerchief, as if touching him had dirtied it. Then he turned to the assembled workers. "This is what happens to saboteurs. This is what happens to those who betray the Reich. Remember it. Do your job properly, or you'll end the same way." They left the body there for 6 more hours as an added warning before allowing it to be removed. Elena and her mother waited the entire time at a distance, unable to approach or touch him, while trains continued to pass through Platform 3, routing around the corpse as if it were just another obstacle on the tracks. After the sparse burial, 3 days later, a different German administrative official came to Elena's house. He was young, maybe 30. He wore glasses and an immaculate uniform that looked freshly pressed. "Your father was a good operator, despite his fatal mistake," he said in slow, carefully simplified German so she could understand. "See, we verified that." East Switch 7 did, in fact, have a defect. Stefan's report was accurate. The accident had, in all likelihood, been mechanical rather than intentional. Elena felt something break inside her. They had killed her father knowing that, almost certainly, he was innocent. He hadn't been executed for justice, but for political convenience. "You know the switches," the officer continued, flipping through the file he had brought with him. "The records show your father trained you from a very young age." Elena nodded in silence, still trying to absorb the admission delivered with such cold calm that her father had been executed for a crime he probably hadn't committed. "Good. We need competent operators. The railway system is vital to the war effort. You start tomorrow. Same post as your father. Same pay. Same shifts. Don't make his mistakes." Elena wanted to scream, to refuse, to spit in his face. But she saw her mother behind him, a 45-year-old woman turned into a widow with no pension, no savings, no way to survive in an occupied city where food was rationed and work was almost non-existent. "When do I start?" she asked, in a voice she barely recognized as her own. For 5 years, Elena operated those same levers. She watched thousands of trains pass, military, civilian, freight, and the others. The Sonder trains, always at night, always sealed, always followed by that uncomfortable silence shared by those who knew and said nothing. She never questioned an order, never pulled the wrong lever, never allowed her emotions to leak into her work, because questioning meant death, and death meant abandoning her mother, who depended on Elena's wages to stay alive. Until the dawn of January 14th, the signal tower where Elena worked was a 3-story structure built in 1922, positioned at the highest point of the station to give a clear view of all the tracks. The first level served as storage for tools and supplies. The second housed the station supervisor's office, Thomas Bishniewski, a 50-year-old Pole who had learned to survive under occupation by being efficient and keeping his mouth shut. The third floor was the control cabin, the operational heart of the entire station. The cabin was a square space, barely 6 meters on each side. The walls were covered with railway maps marked in red pencil, showing damaged sections and routes still in use. A wide window faced north, offering a full view of the main switches. A smaller one looked south, toward passenger platforms that hadn't seen civilians for months. The control panel occupied the entire east wall, 36 black iron levers arranged in 3 rows of 12. Each one was numbered and connected by steel cables to the physical switches on the tracks, sometimes hundreds of meters away. When Elena moved a lever, the cable transmitted the mechanical force that rotated the switch points and changed the route offered to the train's wheels. It was a simple system, but extraordinarily reliable. It required no electricity, no complex communications, just physical strength, exact knowledge of which lever controlled which switch, and the ability to decide quickly when 2 trains approached at the same time. Elena knew that panel like the lines of her own hand. She could operate it in complete darkness. Every number, every connection, every distinctive sound each switch made was etched into her memory. And yet, that morning, exhausted beyond human limits, her hand moved toward the wrong lever, or the right one. It depends on where the story is told from. Sonder Train 47 had departed Auschwitz-Birkenau at 02:15 with orders to collect prisoners from several regional subcamps and transport them west, to camps inside Germany where they could still be processed before the Soviet advance. The convoy consisted of 19 cattle cars. Each car carried between 120 and 140 people in a space designed for 40 cattle. There were no seats, no toilets, no real ventilation beyond narrow gaps between the wooden planks. The floor was covered with filthy straw that barely softened the cold seeping in without mercy through the Polish winter. The prisoners were a chaotic cross-section of what remained of the camp system. Polish Jews, Hungarian Jews, political prisoners, captured partisans, and people whose only crime had been being in the wrong place when the Nazis needed to fill deportation quotas. Among them was David Goldstein, a 32-year-old schoolteacher from Krakow, who had survived 2 years in Auschwitz working in a construction detail. He had learned the unwritten rules of survival. Don't stand out. Don't complain. Don't lose hope entirely. Because hope was the one thing the guards could never take away. When they shoved him into the car at 0340, David knew this transport was different. They hadn't been given even the minimal food ration usually handed out. No destination was announced. The guards looked tense, repeatedly glancing east, where the sky flickered intermittently with distant Soviet artillery. "They're moving us to kill us before the Russians arrive," a Polish prisoner beside him whispered. "They're going to burn the evidence." The train stopped briefly at Radomir's station. David caught fragments of German voices outside, shouted orders, the metallic clang of couplings as additional cars were attached. Then a whistle blew. There was a sharp jolt, and the convoy started moving again. But something felt wrong. David had ridden these trains enough times to recognize routes by the pattern of curves and changes in speed. He felt the train turning in an unexpected direction. It wasn't heading southwest, the logical route toward Germany. It was going northeast. "They're taking us back to Auschwitz," someone said, their voice breaking with terror. "No," David replied quietly. "This isn't the line to Auschwitz. I know that route. This one is different." The train continued northeast for 3 hours. Dawn began to seep through the cracks in the wood. Hungry and freezing, the prisoners pressed against one another for warmth. Some whispered prayers. Others simply waited, silent. At 0752, the train slowed abruptly and came to a halt with a long, shrieking grind of brakes. Absolute silence. No one spoke. Everyone listened. And then they heard something they did not expect. Russian voices. In the signal tower, Elena Novak spent the 3 hours after the train passed, trapped in a state of contained panic, waiting for the Gestapo to appear at any moment. At 0630, Thomas Bishniewski, the station supervisor, came up to the cabin with his thermos of watered-down coffee and his usual expression of permanent concern. "Any problems during the night?" Elena shook her head, not trusting her voice. "Sonder 47 passed without incident, correct?" "Yes. East switch 4. Alternate route." Thomas frowned. "East 4. Wasn't East 3 the scheduled route?" Elena's heart stopped. "There was a last-minute maintenance order on East 3. I got the call at 0415. It was a lie that could easily be verified by checking phone logs, but Thomas simply nodded. "All right, as long as it reached its destination." He left without asking anything else. Elena released her breath slowly. At 0830, the phone rang again. Elena lifted the receiver with a trembling hand. "Radomir's station." The voice on the other end was German. Different, sharper, nervous. "The Hauptmann requires confirmation of Sonder 47's route. We're having difficulty locating it on the network." The floor seemed to drop out from under her. It followed East 4 per last-minute instructions. "What instructions? There's no record of any route change." The voice was now openly alarmed. "East 4 leads toward... That switch sends it directly toward Soviet lines. Who authorized that change?" Elena hung up the phone. Her hands were shaking uncontrollably. Her breathing turned fast and shallow. She had just confirmed what could no longer be denied. She had consciously sent a train full of prisoners toward a zone about to be liberated by the Red Army. She could no longer call it a mistake. In that moment, at 0439, when her hand moved 6 centimeters to the right, she had known exactly what she was doing. And now the Germans knew it too. She ran. Down the metal stairs of the tower, across the nearly empty station, out through the rear door leading to the freight yards. She sprinted past abandoned cars and cold locomotives until she reached the edge of the complex, where a small stand of trees offered some cover. She had no plan, no destination. She only knew that staying meant immediate execution. She plunged into the woods, stumbling over frozen roots, as alarm whistles and German voices shouting orders erupted behind her. Sonder Train 47 was intercepted by an advanced Red Army patrol at 07:52, exactly where Elena had calculated it would be if it followed the route of East Switch 4. The Soviet soldiers, expecting to find a German military convoy, opened the cars cautiously, weapons ready. Instead of enemy troops, they found 2,400 prisoners in varying states of starvation and illness, but alive. David Goldstein was among the first to step out. He dropped to his knees in the snow, not from weakness, but from sheer disbelief. After 2 years of waiting to die, liberation had come in the most unexpected way, on a train that had taken the wrong route. A Soviet officer tried to impose some order on the chaos. "Where are you coming from? What was your destination?" "Auschwitz," David answered in rudimentary Russian learned from Soviet prisoners in the camp. "They were taking us toward Germany, but the train turned. I don't know why." The officer consulted his maps. "This switch makes no sense. The Germans would never send a prisoner transport toward territory we're liberating." "Someone made a massive mistake," David murmured, looking at the tracks disappearing into the distance. "Or someone made a decision." Elena survived 3 days in the forest, eating snow and hiding inside the hollow of a fallen tree. On the 4th day, she heard distant gunfire, but it sounded different, more chaotic, unfamiliar. Then came silence. She emerged cautiously and made her way back toward the station. The Nazi flags were gone. In their place, red Soviet banners hung from the buildings, and soldiers in different uniforms patrolled the platforms. Radomirs had been liberated. Elena walked to the signal tower, expecting to find it destroyed. It was still standing. She climbed the stairs slowly. The control cabin was exactly as she had left it. The panel with its 36 levers, the logbook with the final entry, Sonder Train 47, East Switch 4, alternate route. A Soviet soldier stepped inside. "Who are you?" "Elena Novak, signal operator." "Did you work for the Nazis?" "I worked to keep my mother alive," she answered, her voice exhausted. The soldier studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "Trains aren't Nazi or Soviet. Trains go where they're sent. Can you run this?" "Yes." "Good. We have trains full of wounded that need to reach field hospitals. Start." And so Elena kept operating the same levers, sending trains to different destinations, under different flags, for different purposes. She never spoke of the dawn of January 14th, never mentioned Sonder 47, never explained why she had moved East Switch 4 instead of East 3. 6 weeks later, in March 1945, David Goldstein returned to Radomirs. He had spent that time recovering in a Soviet hospital, slowly gaining weight, relearning how to live without expecting death every second. He wanted to understand what had really happened that morning. Why the train had taken an impossible route. Had it been a mistake or something else? He asked around at the station and was directed to the signal tower. He climbed the stairs and found a young woman at the control panel, her movements precise, steady, efficient. "Were you here on January 14th? David asked. Elena studied him carefully. She saw the striped uniform he was still wearing because he had no other clothes. She saw the numbers tattooed on his arm. She saw the question he couldn't quite bring himself to ask in his eyes. Yes, she answered plainly. Sondertrain 47 was supposed to go to Auschwitz or west. Instead, it turned northeast. She was silent for a long moment, then gestured toward the panel of levers. East 3 goes southeast. East 4 goes northeast. They're 6 centimeters apart. In the dark, after 18 hours without sleep, it's easy to confuse them. David nodded slowly. He understood exactly what she was saying without saying. Thank you for your mistake. It wasn't me, Elena replied, her voice barely audible. It was exhaustion. It was darkness. It was chance. Or maybe it was something else, David said. Maybe it was a decision. Elena didn't answer. David said goodbye with a silent nod and went back down the stairs. They never saw each other again. But decades later, both would remember that brief exchange in the signal tower as the moment when the truth was acknowledged, without ever being named. Elena Novak continued working as a signal operator in Radomierz until 1962. She never married, never had children. She lived with her mother until her mother died in 1956, then remained alone in the same small apartment, 2 streets from the station and the tower where her life had changed forever. Younger workers knew her as the quiet woman, precise to the extreme, never social, never lingering to talk. Some said she had lost a fiancé during the war. Others whispered that she had seen too much under the occupation. No one knew the full story. In 1961, a young Polish historian researching wartime railway operations arrived at the station asking questions about deportation trains. He was told about Elena, one of the few operators who had worked throughout the entire occupation. He found her in the signal tower, working the same levers her father had taught her to use 20 years earlier. Can you tell me about the Sonder trains that passed through here? He asked. They ran at night. They went east. That's all I know, she replied without looking at him. Do you remember January 14, 1945? There's a Soviet report about a prisoner train intercepted near here. Apparently it took the wrong route. Elena looked up. Trains follow the route set by the levers. If a lever is moved incorrectly, the train goes where it wasn't meant to go. And that lever was moved incorrectly. After 18 hours without sleep, all levers look the same in the dark. The historian wrote it down. But that mistake saved 2,400 lives. If it was a mistake, Elena said, turning her attention back to the panel, then it was a fortunate one. And if it wasn't, it shouldn't be remembered. Because remembering it would mean admitting a decision that should never have been made. The historian didn't fully understand her words, but he noted the conversation in his notebook. He never published it. The file sat forgotten in a desk for years. Elena retired in 1962 at 40, with a modest state pension. She moved to Krakow, far from the station, far from the levers, far from the rails that had defined her existence. She lived quietly for the next 33 years, working part-time as a librarian. She died in 1995 at the age of 73, of natural causes. Her obituary mentioned her railway work during and after the war, without details. David Goldstein emigrated to Israel in 1948. He became a teacher again and taught history at a secondary school in Tel Aviv. He married. He had 3 children. He lived a life that had come within minutes of never existing. He never forgot Sonder Train 47. He never forgot how that train had turned in the wrong direction, or the right one, depending on how you look at it. He never forgot the woman in the signal tower who told him it had all been just exhaustion, just darkness, just chance. In 1985, 40 years after liberation, David wrote his memoirs and devoted an entire chapter to Sondertrain 47. He described the sensation of being locked inside that car, waiting for death, and then suddenly hearing Russian voices instead of German. He also recounted his brief conversation with the signal operator, the woman who never openly admitted what she had done. "Was it a mistake or was it heroism?" David wrote. "I will never know for certain. But I do know this. 2,400 people stepped off that train alive because someone, at some moment, decided that 6 centimeters to the right were better than 6 centimeters to the left. And that was enough." The book was published in Hebrew and had a modest circulation in Israel. It was never translated into Polish. Elena never read it. Perhaps if she had, she would have recognized herself in those pages, or perhaps she would have insisted, as she always did, that it was nothing more than exhaustion, darkness, chance. In 2003, a group of survivors from Sondertrain 47 and their descendants gathered in Radomierz to commemorate the day of their liberation. 63 people attended. Some were original survivors, now in their 80s. Others were children and grandchildren of those who had ridden that convoy. Together, they represented the 2,400 lives that continued after January 14, 1945, multiplied across generations. They placed a simple plaque at the station in memory of Sondertrain 47, January 14, 1945. 2,400 lives saved by a change of course. Elena Novak's name was not mentioned because no one was certain what her role had truly been. Had it been a mistake? An act of resistance? A decision made in a fleeting moment of moral clarity? The truth, like so many truths of war, remained buried in the silence of the one who acted. The rails, however, are still there. East Switch 3 and East Switch 4 still function, though today they are controlled electronically rather than by mechanical levers. And every train that passes through Radomierz still follows the path chosen by someone's hand. Elena's story is more complex than simple heroism. She did not plan a rescue operation. She was not part of the resistance. She had no contact with partisans. She was an exhausted woman standing before a panel of levers, faced with a decision she had no time to fully think through. And yet, 2,400 people breathed the cold morning air of January 14, 1945, because her hand moved 6 centimeters to the right instead of remaining where German orders dictated. Their children were born. Their grandchildren now walk the streets of cities their grandparents would never have seen had the train taken the route of East Switch 3. Their great-grandchildren study history without knowing that they themselves exist, thanks to a gesture that lasted barely 2 seconds in a dark signal tower. It all happened because a black iron lever moved in a direction different from the one expected. This story will never be completely clear. It will not appear in grand textbooks or be celebrated with towering monuments, because its essence is ambiguity. It was a mistake, or it was a decision, or perhaps it was both at the same time. But it exists. In railway records, in David Goldstein's memoirs, in the discreet plaque at Radomierz station, in the silence of Elena Novak, who never confirmed or denied what happened, and in the certainty that sometimes saving 2,400 lives does not require elaborate plans or superhuman courage. Sometimes it is enough for a tired hand to move 6 centimeters in the right direction at the precise moment. Elena Novak never knew how many of those people survived the months that followed. She never sought answers or recognition. She only knew that Sondertrain 47 had turned northeast when it was supposed to go southeast. And that turn, intentional or not, had changed thousands of destinies in a single moment. History remembers her in silence, in railway archives, in survivors' memoirs, in the metallic echo of a lever moving in the darkness of a winter dawn nearly 80 years ago. If you know someone in your city or your country whose story deserves to be told, write it in the comments. Perhaps the next invisible hero is closer than you think.